If you're curious about Gessobord or even Aquaboard or Clayboard from Ampersand, this is the video for you. I'll also be testing out the QoR watercolor and cold press grounds applied to the Gessobord. Now you can keep watching the whole video to find out all my thoughts about the grounds and the boards and complete this watercolor and ink lighthouse paint along with me. But if you don't want to do that and you just want to know what I think, the short story is if you want to practice on alternative surfaces from Ampersand, I love their panels. My favorite is Gessobord. My second favorite is Aquaboard. And I wasn't quite a fan of the watercolor ground or the cold press ground from QoR. For the rest of you who want to get into it with me, keep watching. Aside from the Gessobord itself and the watercolor grounds that we're testing today, you can find all the supplies that I'm using in today's video to paint these 3 panels in my Paint 333 supply list that you can get at paint333.com. So I have a 3-pack of 5x7 Gessobords. They are uncradled, they're the flat kind. In general, I have always been really impressed by the quality of Ampersand panels. They don't bow or warp or anything like that. So I'm gonna prep 2 of my panels with these QoR watercolor grounds. I have never done this before. This is a good experiment for me. I'm not quite sure how much to put on. Not very successful with using the brayer, the roller. So I'm just using a dry flat brush. So this is about as flat as I could get it with a dry brush. Let's see if I can get it a little smoother with a wet brush. I think a wet brush smooths it out more, but it also accentuates the lines of the hair of the brush. All right, so I kind of like the way this looks. We'll see how we do with painting on it once it dries. The watercolor ground is much looser than the cold press ground. I'm gonna test it out just applying it with my brush. So I'm getting similar paintbrush lines that I got when I used the cold press ground. Let's see if a brayer will smooth it out. So a brayer, if you can see that, just accentuates that texture. So I'm just gonna use my paintbrush to make it as smooth as I can. I'm wondering too if a couple coats would help these paint lines not show up too. This is our uncoated Gessobord. We have our watercolor ground, 1 layer and 2 layers on the bottom half. And then we have our cold press ground. I wanted to test too how it sands off the edges. And it sands off the edge pretty easily. So if I took more time to finish the edges, I feel like you could do that. Let's test how these erase. So on the uncoated Gessobord, pretty clean erasing, I'd say. Pencil marks erase, I would say about 90%. And the particular brand of carbon transfer paper I'm using, I would say erases maybe 30 to 50% using my kneaded eraser. 1 layer of watercolor ground, about 80 to 90% erased. 2 layers, I'd say closer to 90% erased. And you can erase the carbon, man, maybe about 20. Well, I already erased this a little bit, so you probably can erase this maybe up to 50%, but it's gonna be there. This pencil line, unfortunately, I think I painted over with watercolor ground, so it's kind of gonna be there as well. The cold press ground, pencil marks erase about 90% too. The carbon, maybe I'm picking up about 20% of it or so. So all 3 applications, that carbon transfer is gonna be there. Okay, we let these 2 dry, so we have the watercolor ground, 1 layer and 2 layers at the bottom, and then we have the cold press ground on this side. And after letting these first layers of paint dry, I decided I didn't even want to continue to paint them. But I do want to show you what things could look like should you decide to invest in some of these grounds. Pros, I would say, of the watercolor ground is that we're still seeing some watercolory blooming. I kind of like this granulation that we were able to achieve. And I'm also thinking that maybe if we found a way to apply it where we wouldn't see those brush marks, that granulation would be really beautiful. And that if we didn't have those brush marks from the application distracting us, this could actually be something really, really pretty. I am just not a big fan of how this ended up looking, that I'm not interested in investing the time to finish this painting. But let's go ahead and see if we can achieve some lifting if we needed to. So if we needed to lift here to make this maybe a clearer line. Now the other thing is that technically isn't the skyline. This is the line of between the two layers of ground. So lifting, definitely able to do. Let's try it on the single layer. So this was 2 layers, 1 layer, easily able to lift. Let's see if we can lift neutral tint. And we can. So lifting is definitely something you can do with the watercolor ground. I was curious too if you could scrape it, and I know with scraping you might need to do it while it's wet. But that looks really cool. You can kind of scrape it even when it's dry. You can see those lines. So that could be fun for whiskers. And scraping while it's wet can really get some beautiful scraped lines. So if I was to try a ground again, I think I would be more interested in the watercolor ground, lifting and scraping, and it's blooming and granulating. All things that I would want to see for a watercolor substrate. Going to the cold press ground, I was really excited about this, but it looks really flat to me, doesn't it? I don't see any granulation. Obviously, texture is great. You can achieve some really cool texture techniques. Let's see if you can scrape. And you can scrape, so that's kind of cool. It's not as clean of a scrape as you get with the watercolor ground. Let's see if you can lift. This is interesting. I'm not getting as easy of a lift with the cold press ground. And I'm wondering too if I can reactivate an area and see what scraping looks like on a wet surface. Nah, that's really anticlimactic there. And I don't know, that lifting, definitely not as precise as the lifting with the watercolor ground. So, not a fan of the cold press ground. But don't let that stop you if it seems like it could work for your particular style. Overall, I'm more impressed with the watercolor ground with the things that we had already talked about. This is the panel that's just plain Gessobord. There's no watercolor ground on it. It has some splatters on it just because I'm a messy painter with my other paintings. So I'm a little bit more familiar with this surface just because I had that big project. So I am going to paint some texture on here. And this is typically how I would paint too with watercolor, where I'd have a brush with color on it and then a watery brush. I'm using quinacridone gold and buff titanium, neutral tint still, painting right onto the dry gesso board. And I think what I'd like to do, just from my experience so far painting on these panels, is try to keep some of that white lines between the shape instead of completing the shapes entirely. It helps distinguish the shapes themselves. I think it looks kind of nice. I'm gonna grab, let's do a similar thing to what we were doing before, getting some sky in here. I don't know if this is turning out better simply because I've used it before, or so I kind of know what to expect, or if I'm just taking more time. Okay, so I have my ultramarine, I have my buff titanium. I'm going right under the dry paper with a watery mix here, and I'm trying to keep that a little bit of a white space between the shapes. And I'm wondering if I can try to achieve a little bit more interest by not completely filling in the entire panel. A lot of this lighthouse is white too, so I want to make sure I get enough blue around it. So let's see if I can just blend that into the rest of the panel with some water. I'm going to take a little bit of that pigment out. It just seems like there's a lot right now. I could see how you could achieve some cool looking cloud shapes with this. So I'm just going to go all the way to the top with the water, see what happens when I do it that way. I don't want it to be too textured. It's interesting to see how it flows with water. I used my favorite ink pen, the Uniball Deluxe, to create the ink lines on this painting. I am in love with how this ended up drying. I think the con is you do get this kind of speckly texture, but it's very subtle. So I wouldn't let that sway me from not working with Gessobord. So this is the uncoated straight up Gessobord. Takes to watercolor beautifully, I think. We were able to achieve some blooming. We have some kind of watercolory blooming edges here. It's still a little bit wet up here. You can kind of see how the water moves on the Gessobord. So you're able to achieve this kind of controlled look with the dry painting and even with the wet and wet, controlling the edges, but then letting it dry in really beautiful ways to achieve some watercolory effects. Just totally over the moon about how this turned out. And you can see I added some ink into the painting. Let's just finish it off. I want to hopefully finish it off quickly and kind of not overwork it. Again, I'm trying also to maintain these white edges that I even wanted to maintain, even though I put some ink on it. Those little white transitions, I think are just gorgeous. Really, really pretty. So I'm trying to get that a little bit. Now there is a little bit of buff titanium in my ultramarine here, so it is kind of covering up where we put ink. Maybe, love that. I think that's all we need to establish the water. And I don't want this to get rainbowy. I'm loving the gold and the blue, but I definitely want to take advantage of the red. So what I think I'd like to do is finish the areas that are dark. So we have the black. There's a lot on my brush there. Just gonna swipe some of that off. So I have neutral tint on my round brush, and I'm just gonna fill in these really dark areas. And I'm gonna be a little bit rough with it. It doesn't have to be perfect because it's this really nice pen and ink wash style. So we don't have to go overboard or be too picky. There we go. I put in a little drop of water right on top of the black so that it would dry with some wateriness. Love that. And that's so cool that this gesso board does that. And it's just a little bit really goes a long way. It doesn't soak in very much. So you don't need as much paint as you might think. Wonder if I can get a little bit of a tint on the bottom here. I love preserving white, but it's also nice to keep in mind some of these values that we have happening. So I'm just giving the building a little bit of dimension and shading with some neutral tint. Kind of dip my brush into this really messy well of buff titanium that has some ultramarine in there and some neutral tint. And then we can finish this off with some really fun, like a really fun pop of red. You can see too, I already signed it. I put my name on there. I put Canal Park, and you know, now that I think of it, it might not technically be part of Canal Park. It might even be on the Wisconsin side of where this particular landmark is. But to me, that whole area of Duluth, right by Superior there, where the harbor is Canal Park to me. All right, I'm going to mix up a red. Actually, let's go over here. So this is kind of my red/orange well. I have all my secondary wells over here. So for me, since I don't actually have a red in my palette, I use my Opera Pink. And I just put a little bit of Azo Yellow in there. And that brightens it up and makes it look red. And I'm not usually a red person, but this is important, this landmark, for it to be red and not pink. So let's see what this looks like. Ooh, very pretty. It's interesting, I'm getting a little bit of resist happening here too. And I wonder if that's partly because of the transfer paper. Now I kind of overpainted into some white areas, so we're going to see how well this lifts off. And it's bleeding into here. I'm going to just bring that down. A little hint of red on that side, it's kind of cool. This is still wet, but we'll see if we can lift off on this shape where it's supposed to be white. And that looks awesome. So that might be something where I need to let it dry too, and then come in and lift. But, and this was my experience too, working with the large panels. And I've worked with really large panels of Gessobord, and I had a similar experience where it was very easy to lift off color. Although staining colors sometimes stain and stick with the panel a little bit. But it's very forgiving in that sense. So I'll let that dry, probably lift off some of those white areas, and maybe even do a second coat of red. I have some splatter here. Pick that up. I'm curious to see if I can achieve, I think a toothbrush would be a better tool for a type of fine splatter that I'm hoping to get. But I'm wondering if I can get a little bit of splatter here. That actually looks really cool. I'm gonna lift off some of the splatter that I didn't really care for. I like that little bit of darker ultramarine at the top. So the red, the first layer of red is dry, and I was easily able to lift this little bit of red around the window off. I'll show you this on the smokestack here. Lifting that red, very easy to do. Lifting is 10 out of 10. Love it on the Gessobord. Now, I don't technically need to scrape this painting, but I also want to see what, if I can. Let's see, it could look cool scraping next to the railing. Should we try that? So not able to get any kind of layer off there. Can we get a layer off here? I'm wondering if it's wet, if we would be able to achieve a scraped line. So let's see, I'll activate this area. Get it wet, see what happens. That's more successful. So you can see the pigment kind of going into that scraped line there. So I would say with the Gessobord, if you need to scrape, you're going to want to do that while it's still wet. There we go. Another little layer of red. It was so pretty. And one final interesting tidbit is that you can actually lift off the ink pen on Gessobord, which is something you cannot do on watercolor paper. So I completely erased my little Canal Park sign when I tried to add a layer of paint here. So just keep that in mind. Maybe that's a pro. And I don't think it's a pro or a con. I think it's just a property you need to be aware of. Here's what the final Gessobord sample painting looks like. So now having tried Aquaboard, Clayboard, Gessobord, and Gessobord with both watercolor ground and cold press ground, I would say my favorite application is just the plain Gessobord. Here's some examples of Aquaboard paintings I've done in the past, and those have done very well. I would say it's all the benefits of Gessobord, plus a little bit more watercoloriness. It takes to watery techniques even better. But it has a really gritty surface texture that kind of shows through your washes that I don't really care for. So for that reason alone, I would prefer Gessobord. But if you're interested in trying either of these substrates, I would try both and see which one you like better, both Aquaboard and Gessobord. Clayboard, I don't have a picture. I did a portrait in Clayboard, but it very much behaves like you would expect Yupo paper to. it's not very absorbent, and it gets very kind of watery. It maintains that wet look even when it's dry because the water just kind of sits on the surface. So if you like that Yupo watery look, you can do that, but it is a little bit harder to get control, and it's harder to achieve the typical watery techniques that we would like to see on clayboard. But in general, I've always found the Ampersand panels to be very high quality. They are made on this composite board that just stays perfectly flat. So this is uncradled, but the cradled versions, the uncradled versions, just so high quality, very, very nice. But if you are going super large, it is important to get a cradle on there just so they don't warp. Something this small is very unlikely to warp, but it could happen, especially if you store it in funny ways. So I just like to get a cradle on there if you're working really large. Here are some fun animal faces I painted on a really large 36 by 48 panel of Gessobord. It is cradled, and it was just a ton of fun. I painted it actually right side up instead of flat, and so there's a lot of drips that happened, but I kind of embraced those, leaned into it, and it ended up being a really fun project for this pet rescue. I kind of like to think of Gessobord kind of as a cross between Yupo paper and watercolor paper because it's really forgiving in the fact that you can lift really easily, and it's not as absorbent as watercolor paper. So my top two recommendations would be Gessobord and Aquaboard, with Gessobord being my preference. As for the watercolor grounds, I wasn't too excited about either of them, although I do prefer that watercolor ground more than the cold press ground. But this was a very small test, and I think that they would deserve another chance and maybe a different way of applying them to the panel before I completely write them off.